1935. The world was already on fire. Adolf Hitler had just announced his military rearmament program. Mussolini was marching into Ethiopia. Stalin was quietly purging his closest allies. Every major power on the planet was positioning itself for something catastrophic, and everyone knew it. But in the middle of all that chaos, something happened that barely made the front page of any newspaper. Something small, something quiet, something that most historians still treat as a footnote. A telegram was sent, not a declaration of war, not a treaty, just a telegram dispatched from Tehran to every embassy, every consulate, every diplomatic post around the world, and the message was short, almost shockingly short for something so consequential. It said essentially, no explanation, no press conference, no grand ceremony with flags and speeches. A directive from the Shah of a powerful, ancient nation demanding that the entire world reach back into its atlases, its textbooks, its letterheads, and scratch out a name that had been there for over 2,000 years. Think about what that actually means. The name Persia had been on Western maps since before the birth of Christ. It was the name that Alexander the Great used when he dreamed of conquering the known world. It was the name that Marco Polo wrote in his journals. It was the name that Shakespeare referenced. The name that traders, kings, soldiers, and scholars across 3 continents had used for more than 2 millennia to describe one of the greatest civilizations this planet has ever produced. And in 1935, a single man decided that name was over. Now here is where most history books just move on. They give you the official explanation. Something about national identity. Something about modernization. Something about wanting to align with other countries in the region. Neat, tidy, reasonable. But here is the thing about neat and tidy explanations for massive, world-altering decisions. They almost never tell you the whole story. Because when you start pulling on this thread, when you actually dig into who pushed for this name change, and when and why, the story gets very strange, very fast. You find Nazi Germany. You find an ancient religious prophecy that is over 3,000 years old. You find a secret society of firekeepers who have been guarding hidden texts for centuries. And you find a buried civilization that some archaeologists believe may be the oldest on the face of the earth. A civilization whose very existence challenges everything we think we know about where human history actually began. And all of it, every single piece of it, connects back to that one quiet telegram in 1935. So tonight, we are not just talking about a name change. We are talking about a mystery that stretches from the courts of Cyrus the Great to the bunkers of the Third Reich. We are talking about a word so powerful that entire governments have gone to war over it. We are talking about a secret that has been hiding in plain sight, written on every map, every passport, every international document for the last 90 years. The name is Iran, and you are about to find out what it really means. Let me ask you something. When you hear the word Persia, what comes to mind? Gold, silk, towering marble columns, a king sitting on a jeweled throne, commanding armies that stretched from the Mediterranean all the way to the borders of India. The hanging gardens, the royal road, the world's first postal system, the world's first declaration of human rights, written on a clay cylinder over 2,500 years ago by a man named Cyrus, a man so extraordinary that the Hebrew Bible calls him the anointed one of God. Persia is a word that feels like a dream, ancient and golden and impossibly grand. Now, when you hear the word Iran, what comes to mind? Be honest. For most people in the Western world, the answer is very different. News footage, political tension, sanctions and nuclear negotiations and headlines that make you nervous. A country that feels closed off, guarded, difficult to understand. Same land, same people, same mountains and deserts and rivers that have been there since the dawn of recorded history. 2 completely different worlds living inside 2 different names. And that gap, that enormous, jarring gap between those 2 words and everything they carry that is not an accident, that gap was engineered. Here is what I want you to hold on to as we go through this story together. The name Persia was never what the people of that land called themselves. Not once, not in 3,000 years of continuous civilization. When Cyrus the Great built the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, he did not call it Persia. When Darius stood before his armies at the gates of Greece, he did not call himself Persian. When the great poets and philosophers and astronomers of that civilization wrote their masterworks, they used a completely different word. They called themselves Arya. That word Arya is the root of everything. It is older than the Persian Empire, older than the Achaemenid dynasty. It appears in the most ancient religious texts ever discovered, written in a language so old that linguists are still arguing about exactly how to translate it. And it is the direct ancestor of the word Iran, which, stripped down to its oldest meaning, simply means the land of the Arya. Now I know what some of you are thinking. You heard that word Arya, and something in your brain immediately connected it to something dark. To the 20th century, to a certain ideology that hijacked that ancient word and twisted it into something monstrous. But here is the truth that almost nobody talks about. The Nazis did not invent the concept of the Aryan people. They stole it. They reached back thousands of years into the history of this land, ripped out an ancient identity, and weaponized it for their own propaganda. The real Arya were not a blonde-haired, blue-eyed fantasy from Central Europe. They were the founders of one of the most sophisticated, multi-ethnic, religiously tolerant empires in human history. And when Iran officially took back its ancient name in 1935, the timing, the context, and the people involved in that decision were far more complicated and far more disturbing than anyone in power wanted the world to know. This is what we are going to unpack tonight, layer by layer. We are going to look at the man who ordered the name change and the shadowy figures who put the idea in his head and who ended up dead shortly after. We are going to look at the ancient religious prophecy buried inside the Zoroastrian scriptures, a prophecy that some scholars believe the name change was specifically designed to fulfill. We are going to look at the Nazi expeditions that came to Iran in the 1930s, searching for something they believed was hidden in these ancient lands. And we are going to look at a civilization discovered in the early 2000s, buried under the Iranian desert, that may be older than Egypt, older than Sumer, and older than anything our history books are currently prepared to explain. By the time we are done tonight, you will never hear the words Persia or Iran the same way again. Because this is not a story about geopolitics. It is not a story about diplomacy or national branding, or one king trying to modernize his country's image. This is a story about identity, about memory, about who gets to name the world and who gets to control what those names mean. And it starts, as so many of the strangest and most important stories in human history start, with a secret, one that has been hiding in plain sight for 90 years. Let us go find it. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you are standing in the ancient city of Persepolis. It is around 500 BC. The city is alive in a way that is almost impossible to describe. Tens of thousands of workers, artists, soldiers, diplomats, and merchants moving through streets lined with carved stone reliefs that stretch taller than a 2-story building. The palace complex alone covers an area larger than 14 football fields. The columns rise 37 feet into the air, carved from limestone so precisely fitted that even today, 2,500 years later, not a single one of them has fallen from an earthquake. And at the center of all of it, on a throne surrounded by delegations from 28 different nations, sits the most powerful man on earth. Now here is the question I want you to think about while you are standing there, looking up at that king on that throne. What does he call himself? Because if you walked up to Darius the Great, if you somehow crossed the centuries and stood before one of the most accomplished rulers in the entire history of human civilization, and you said the word Persian to him, he would have absolutely no idea what you were talking about. That word would mean nothing to him. Darius called himself something else entirely. In his own inscriptions, carved directly into the rock face of a cliff at a place called Behistun, inscriptions that archaeologists discovered in the 1800s and spent decades decoding. He describes himself with striking clarity. He says, and I am translating this as directly as possible, I am Darius, the great king, king of kings, king of Persia, son of Hystaspes, an Achaemenian, an Aryan, son of an Aryan, an Aryan. That is how one of the greatest kings who ever lived chose to identify himself, not by the name of his empire, not by the Greek label that outsiders were beginning to attach to his people, but by this ancient, almost sacred designation Arya that connected him to something much older and much deeper than any political boundary on a map. So where did the word Persia actually come from? The answer is surprisingly simple and surprisingly revealing. In the southwestern corner of what is now modern Iran, there is a region that has been inhabited for thousands of years. In ancient times, this region was called Pars, or sometimes Parsa. It was just one province among many in a vast territory, a homeland of sorts for the particular tribal group that produced Cyrus the Great and eventually built the Achaemenid Empire. When the Greeks started encountering this empire through trade, through the famous Persian Wars that inspired some of the greatest storytelling in Western literature, they needed a name for these people. And so they did what people have always done when they encounter something unfamiliar. They took the one part they recognized, the part they had heard about first, and they applied it to everything. They called the whole civilization after that one southwestern province. Pars became Persis in Greek, Persis became Persia in Latin, and Persia eventually became the name that the entire Western world used for the next 2,500 years to describe a civilization that had never once called itself by that name. Think about how extraordinary that is. An entire civilization, one of the most advanced, most geographically expansive, most culturally sophisticated civilizations in the history of the world, was renamed by outsiders, by people who were, in many cases, their enemies. The Greeks who coined the term Persia were the same Greeks who were fighting desperately to keep this empire from swallowing their city-states whole. The Romans who cemented Persia in the Western imagination were the same Romans who spent centuries locked in conflict with its successor empires. The name Persia is, in a very real sense, a name given to a people by their rivals. And here is where it gets even more interesting, because the people of this land were not passive about their own identity. While the outside world was busy calling them Persians, they were actively maintaining a completely separate sense of who they were, rooted in language, in religion, in a cosmological worldview that stretched back to a time before written history. The ancient Iranians, and I am using that word deliberately, in its correct historical context, were the people who produced one of the oldest surviving religious texts on Earth. For most of recorded history, two names existed for the same land at the same time, and almost nobody talked about it. On Western maps, in European courts, in the letters of merchants and the journals of explorers, and the dispatches of military commanders, the land was Persia. Always Persia. That was the name that moved through the channels of international commerce and diplomacy like a current through water. But in the valleys and the mountain passes and the ancient cities of that same land, among the scholars and the priests and the poets who kept the deepest traditions alive, the name was something else entirely. It was Iran. Written into sacred texts, embedded in the oldest living language traditions on the continent, carried quietly, carefully, almost protectively, the way you carry something precious that you are afraid someone might try to take from you. These two names were not simply two words for the same thing. They represented two completely different ways of understanding what this civilization actually was. Persia was the external face. The brand, you might say, if you want to use a modern word for it. It was grand and impressive, and it communicated something specific to the outside world: power, antiquity, sophistication, the romance of the ancient East. Persia was what you showed the world when you wanted the world to be dazzled. Iran was something else. Iran was internal, private, sacred, in a way that is difficult to translate into modern language without losing something essential. Iran was the name that appeared in religious contexts, in cosmological texts, in the kind of writing that was never meant for foreign eyes. It was the name that connected the living to their ancestors, and their ancestors to something even older than memory. Think of it this way. Persia was the throne room. Iran was the inner sanctum. And for centuries, these two identities existed in a kind of uneasy parallel, one visible to the world, one carefully hidden from it. Now, to understand why that matters, you need to understand the religion that kept the name Iran alive through conquest after conquest, through empire after empire, through century after century of being ruled by outsiders who wanted to reshape this civilization in their own image. That religion was Zoroastrianism, and if you are not deeply familiar with it, I want to take a moment here because almost nothing in this story makes sense without it. Zoroastrianism is, by most scholarly accounts, the world's first monotheistic religion. It predates Judaism in its organized form, It almost certainly influenced the development of Christianity and Islam in ways that mainstream religious history has been remarkably reluctant to fully acknowledge. The concepts of heaven and hell, of a final judgment, of a cosmic battle between good and evil, of a savior figure who will appear at the end of time. All of these ideas appear in Zoroastrian theology centuries before they show up in the Abrahamic traditions. The founder of this religion, the prophet Zoroaster, sometimes called Zarathustra, is one of the most enigmatic figures in the entire history of human thought. Scholars cannot agree on when he lived. Some place him around 1500 BC. Some place him earlier, around 1000 BC. And some of the most ancient Zoroastrian traditions themselves claim he lived 6,000 years before a certain famous Greek war, which would push his existence back to roughly 6000 BC, making him contemporaneous with the very earliest agricultural civilizations on Earth. Nobody knows. And that uncertainty is itself a kind of clue, a sign that whatever Zoroaster was, whatever he taught, it reached back into a period of human history so remote that even the people who inherited his tradition could not see clearly to the beginning of it. What we do know is this. The texts that Zoroaster produced, or that were produced in his name collectively, called the Avesta, contain some of the most remarkable writing in the ancient world, and running through all of it, like a thread of gold woven into an immense tapestry, is the concept of Iran, of Ariana, of the sacred homeland, of the land where truth was first spoken and first understood. For the Zoroastrian priesthood, a class of men called the Magi, a word you may recognize from a completely different religious tradition. The name Iran was not just a geographical designation, it was a theological statement. To say Iran was to affirm an entire cosmology, to assert that this land was not simply one nation among many, but the original land, the axis around which all of human history revolved. Now here is where the two names begin to collide in genuinely dangerous ways. When Alexander the Great destroyed Persepolis in 330 BC, burning one of the great wonders of the ancient world to the ground, reportedly, in a drunken celebration after a party, he did not just destroy a building. He scattered the Zoroastrian priesthood. He disrupted the transmission of sacred texts that had been passed down through oral tradition for generations. And in doing so, he created a split that would define Iranian identity for the next 2,000 years. The public face Persia became subject to outside conquest, outside influence, outside naming. The Greeks renamed things, the Arabs renamed things, the Mongols renamed things. Each successive wave of conquest brought with it a new set of labels, a new set of frameworks, a new set of people who thought they understood this civilization better than its own inhabitants did. But the inner name Iran survived. It survived in the Avesta. It survived in the Zoroastrian communities that maintained their traditions even as the official religion of the land changed around them. It survived in the poetry of Ferdowsi, the 10th century AD Persian poet who spent 30 years writing the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, an epic poem of 60,000 verses that is essentially a monument to Iranian identity, written at a time when the ruling class was Arab and the dominant religion was Islam. Ferdowsi did not call his great work the Book of Persian Kings. He wrote about Iran, about Iranians. And then there were the others. The ones who preserved things in ways that were even less visible. Within the Zoroastrian tradition, there existed, and still exists today, a priestly class that maintained texts and rituals that were never shared with the general population. A tradition of esoteric knowledge that sat beneath the public face of the religion the way a root system sits beneath the visible surface of a forest. These were not fringe figures or heretics. They were the Athravan, the firekeepers, the men and women whose entire purpose was to maintain the sacred flame, both literally and metaphorically. In certain Athravan traditions, the name Iran carried a specific ritual weight. Speaking it correctly, in the right context, with the right intention, was understood as an act of connection, a reaching back through time to Ariana Vayeja, to the original land, to the moment before the great cosmic struggle between light and darkness had fully begun. To say Iran was, in some traditions, to make a claim about the future as much as the past. It was to say, we are still here. We remember who we are, and what was promised will still come to pass. Now, hold that thought, Because in the early 1930s, as Reza Shah began consolidating his power in Tehran and entertaining visitors from Europe with very particular interests in ancient Aryan bloodlines, someone in his inner circle clearly understood the weight of that name. Someone knew exactly what they were reaching for when they drafted that telegram, and someone else, someone in a black uniform in Berlin, was reading the same ancient texts and reaching for the exact same thing from the opposite direction. The question that historians have never fully answered is whether those two reaching hands were moving independently of each other, or whether they were connected by something older and darker than either government wanted anyone to know. Before we go any further, I have to stop and ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this right now? I mean that genuinely. Because this channel has reached people in places that honestly surprise me every single time I look at the numbers. People watching from Tehran, from London, from small towns in the American Midwest at 2 in the morning, from places I would never have expected this kind of story to land. So, drop it in the comments right now. Your country, your city, what time it is where you are. I read these. I actually read them. And if this story is hitting you the way I think it is, if you are feeling that particular feeling of realizing that something you thought you understood is actually something much stranger and much deeper, then make sure you are subscribed, because we are only about a third of the way through, and it gets considerably darker from here. To understand what happened in 1935, you first have to understand the man who made it happen. And Reza Shah Pahlavi is one of the most fascinating and most unsettling figures in the entire history of the 20th century. He was not born into power, not even close. He was born in 1878 in a small village in the mountains of northern Iran, a region called Mazandaran, rugged and cold, and about as far from the gilded halls of imperial power as you can imagine. His father died when he was an infant. His mother, unable to care for him alone, eventually sent him to live with relatives in Tehran. He had no formal education to speak of, no aristocratic connections, no inherited wealth or title or land. What he had was something harder to define and considerably more dangerous. He had an almost terrifying physical presence, reportedly standing well over 6 feet tall at a time when the average Iranian man was considerably shorter, combined with an instinct for power that seemed to operate on a level beyond ordinary political calculation. People who encountered him in his early military career described the experience in almost visceral terms. That being in the same room with him felt like standing too close to something that generated its own gravity. He rose through the Persian Cossack Brigade, a military force originally organized by Russian officers through a combination of genuine military competence and a ruthlessness that he never bothered to disguise. By 1921, he had participated in a coup that effectively ended the Qajar dynasty's control over the country. By 1925, the last Qajar Shah had been formally deposed by an act of parliament, and Reza Khan, the soldier from the mountains, had crowned himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, founder of a new imperial dynasty. He named the dynasty after an ancient Iranian word, Pahlavi, a reference to the Middle Persian language, the language of the Sasanian Empire, the last great pre-Islamic Iranian civilization. Even in naming his dynasty, he was reaching backward, claiming an ancient lineage that his blood did not actually possess. And this tells you something essential about Reza Shah that you need to carry with you through everything that follows. He was obsessed with authenticity he did not have, with ancient grandeur he had not inherited, with the idea of Iran as a primordial, world historical civilization, and with himself as the man destined to restore it to that status. This obsession shaped everything he did as Shah. He launched sweeping modernization programs. He built roads and railways and universities. He forced men to wear Western-style hats and prohibited women from wearing the veil in public changes so jarring to traditional society that some women reportedly refused to leave their homes rather than go unveiled. He was, in many ways, a modernizer in the mold of Ataturk in Turkey, or Peter the Great in Russia, men who believed they could drag their countries into the modern world through sheer force of will, whether their countries wanted to come or not. But underneath all of that, modernization ran a deep, almost mystical current of ancient Iranian nationalism. Reza Shah did not want Iran to simply become a modern country. He wanted it to become a modern country that remembered and asserted its identity as the oldest and greatest civilization on earth. Which brings us to the name change, and to a man named Abdol Hossein Teymourtash. If Reza Shah was the muscle behind the transformation of Iran in the 1920s and 30s, Teymourtash was the brain. He served as Minister of Court, essentially the Shah's most powerful advisor and the architect of Iran's foreign policy during the period of most intense transformation. He was educated in Russia and deeply familiar with European political philosophy. He spoke multiple languages. He moved comfortably in the corridors of European power in a way that Reza Shah, for all his physical dominance, never quite managed. And Teymourtash was the man who first formally proposed that Iran demand the world change its name. The official account says this was a straightforward diplomatic initiative, a matter of national pride and international recognition. Iran had always called itself Iran. It was simply time for the rest of the world to show enough respect to use the correct name. That explanation is not wrong, exactly, but it is profoundly incomplete, because when you look at the timing of Teymourtash's proposal and the company he was keeping when he made it, a very different picture begins to emerge. In the early 1930s, Iran was receiving an increasing number of visitors from Germany. Not just diplomats and businessmen, though there were plenty of those. Germany had become Iran's largest trading partner by the mid-1930s, a relationship that Reza Shah actively cultivated as a counterweight to British and Soviet influence in the region. But among the German visitors were others. Scholars, researchers, men with specific institutional affiliations and very specific intellectual interests. They were interested in archaeology, in ancient texts, in the physical and cultural evidence of what they believed was an original Aryan homeland. And Iran, with its ancient ruins, its Zoroastrian fire temples, its linguistic connections to Sanskrit, its direct etymological link to the word Aryan itself was, for these men, the most important place on earth. We will go much deeper into who these men were and what they were looking for in the next section. He was, by multiple historical accounts, in direct communication with German cultural and political figures at the highest levels during precisely the period when the name change proposal was being developed. Was the name change proposal shaped by those conversations? Was it, at least in part, a signal, a deliberate invocation of the ancient Aryan identity that both Iranian nationalists and certain very powerful German ideologues were simultaneously fixated on? The historical record does not give us a clean answer, but it gives us enough to make the question impossible to dismiss. And then there is what happened to Teymourtash himself. In 1932, just a few years before the name change decree was issued, Teymourtash was suddenly arrested. The charges were vague corruption, treason, the kind of accusations that powerful men in unstable regimes deploy when they want to remove someone without explaining their real reasons. He was imprisoned, and in 1933, he died in prison under circumstances that were, to put it very gently, never fully explained. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. Teymourtash was 50 years old, the man who conceived the name change, the man who had built the international relationships that made it possible, the man who arguably understood more about what the name Iran actually meant and what invoking it would signal to the world, was dead before the decree he had designed was ever issued. And Reza Shah, the man who signed that decree 2 years later, never publicly explained why his most trusted advisor and the architect of his foreign policy had died in one of his own prisons. This pattern of the man with the deepest knowledge being silenced before the plan reaches completion is one that appears, with uncomfortable frequency, throughout this entire story. It is the kind of pattern that, when you encounter it once, you note as a coincidence. When you encounter it twice, you start to pay closer attention. And when you encounter it a third time, you stop calling it a coincidence at all. Because the truth is, by 1935, when that telegram went out to the embassies of the world, the name change was no longer just a diplomatic initiative, or a nationalist statement, or even a calculated signal to Germany. It had become something that nobody involved in it could fully control anymore. The word Iran was back in the world. Official, formal, recognized by international law and diplomatic protocol. And with it came everything that word had always carried: 3,000 years of sacred history, of Zoroastrian prophecy, of ancient claims about the original homeland of human civilization. Reza Shah had reached back into the deepest roots of his culture and pulled something up into the light. Whether he fully understood what he had pulled up and what it would eventually set in motion is a question that history, so far, has not answered. But someone in Berlin was watching very carefully, and they believed they understood it completely. There is an organization that most people have never heard of, and that is not an accident. It was called the Ahnenerbe, which translates roughly from German as ancestral heritage, or inheritance of the ancestors. It was founded in 1935, the same year as the Iranian name change, and I want you to sit with that coincidence for a moment before we move on by Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and one of the most powerful and most terrifying men in the entire Nazi apparatus. On paper, the Ahnenerbe was a research institute, an academic organization dedicated to studying the history and culture of the ancient world. It had proper offices and a proper budget and proper academic credentials. It published journals. It sponsored expeditions. It employed archaeologists and linguists and historians and anthropologists from some of the most respected universities in Germany. In reality, it was something considerably more disturbing. The Ahnenerbe was Himmler's personal instrument for proving through whatever combination of genuine scholarship, creative interpretation, and outright fabrication was necessary that an ancient master race of Aryan supermen had once dominated the entire world, that this race had been the source of every great civilization in human history, and that the German people were their direct descendants, destined by blood and history to reclaim that dominance. This was not a fringe belief within the SS. This was doctrine, official, institutionally supported, lavishly funded doctrine. And to prove it, Himmler needed evidence. Physical evidence, archaeological evidence, evidence that could be pointed to and held up and shown to the world, which meant expeditions to the places where this ancient Aryan civilization was supposed to have originated. And at the top of that list, above Tibet, above Iceland, above Scandinavia, above every other location that the Ahnenerbe researchers had theorized about, was Iran. The reasoning was, from a certain angle, almost logical. Iran meant land of the Aryans. That was not a theory or an interpretation. That was etymology. Straightforward, documentable, academically verifiable etymology. The ancient Zoroastrian texts used the word Aryana, the direct ancestor of Iran, to describe the original homeland of the people who called themselves Arya. Those same texts described these people as the founders of civilization, the first humans to live in organized, spiritually enlightened communities. For Himmler and the Ahnenerbe researchers, this was not mythology. This was history. Suppressed history. History that the academic establishment, which they believed was dominated by Jewish and liberal scholars with an agenda to minimize the achievements of the Aryan race, had deliberately buried, and they were going to dig it up. German researchers began arriving in Iran in increasing numbers through the 1930s. Some came as official representatives of German academic institutions. Some came through cultural exchange programs that the Reza Shah government actively encouraged as part of its broader pro-German foreign policy orientation. Some came through channels that were considerably less official and considerably less transparent. They went to Persepolis. They went to Pasargadae, the burial site of Cyrus the Great. They went to the ancient Zoroastrian fire temples still burning in the desert. They collected artifacts, made measurements, photographed inscriptions, and sent detailed reports back to Berlin. What they found both thrilled and complicated their theories in equal measure, because the actual history of ancient Iran was, in almost every way, the opposite of what Nazi racial ideology needed it to be. The Achaemenid Empire, the empire of Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes, was not a racially homogeneous master race civilization. It was one of the most deliberately multicultural and religiously tolerant political systems the ancient world had ever produced. Cyrus the Great famously freed the Jewish people from Babylonian captivity and allowed them to return to their homeland, an act so extraordinary that it is recorded in detail in the Hebrew Bible. The administrative language of the empire was Aramaic, a Semitic language, specifically because it was the most widely understood tongue across the diverse populations the empire governed. Darius the Great, in his own inscriptions at Behistun, the same inscriptions where he calls himself an Aryan, describes his empire as a place where people of all nations are treated according to their own customs and governed according to their own laws. This was not the ideology of racial supremacy. This was, in many ways, its direct opposite. But the Ahnenerbe researchers were not primarily interested in what ancient Iran actually was. They were interested in what it could be made to mean, and certain elements of the Iranian historical and cultural record were, for their purposes, extraordinarily useful. The linguistic connections were real. The Indo-European language family, which includes Sanskrit, Old Avestan, Ancient Greek, Latin, and the Germanic languages, does trace back to a common ancestral tongue that linguists believe originated somewhere in the Eurasian steppe. The ancient Iranians and the ancient Indians who composed the Vedas were genuinely related peoples who had separated from a common ancestor culture sometime around 2000 BC. These connections were not invented by the Nazis. They were legitimate scholarly findings that had been established by European linguists in the 19th century. What the Ahnenerbe did was take those legitimate linguistic and cultural connections and push them through the distorting lens of racial ideology until they became something unrecognizable. And in doing so, they created a relationship with Iran and with the Iranian name change of 1935 that was deeply, uncomfortably entangled. Reza Shah was aware of the German fascination with ancient Iranian civilization. He was, by most accounts, privately pleased by it. Not because he shared Nazi racial ideology. The evidence for that is considerably more complicated than a simple yes or no, but because it served his purposes. Here was the most powerful rising nation in Europe, a nation that was challenging British dominance on a global scale, telling the world that Iran was not a backwards country in need of Western management. Iran was the original civilization, the source, the ancient homeland of the people who had built the modern world. For a Shah who had spent his entire reign trying to assert Iranian sovereignty against British and Soviet interference, that narrative was genuinely useful, regardless of where it came from or what it was attached to, and the Germans understood that their interest in ancient Iran was useful to Reza Shah, which is why the cultural exchanges and the archaeological access and the economic partnerships all deepened simultaneously throughout the same years that the name change was being planned and executed. But there was another layer to this relationship, one that operated below the level of official government policy. Within the Ahnenerbe, there was a specific division focused on what they called Weltaislehre, a pseudo-scientific cosmological theory that proposed the universe had been shaped by a catastrophic cosmic battle between fire and ice. This theory, bizarre as it sounds, was taken with complete seriousness by Himmler and several of his closest advisors, and it connected, in ways that they found deeply significant, to the Zoroastrian cosmology they were studying in the ancient Iranian texts. Zoroastrianism describes the world as the battleground of two cosmic forces, Ahura Mazda, the god of light and truth, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of darkness and deception. This eternal struggle between light and darkness, creation and destruction, was something that certain Ahnenerbe researchers believed was not purely metaphorical. They believed it was a cultural memory of actual cosmic events that their own pseudo-scientific cosmological theories could explain. The Zoroastrian texts and the Nazi cosmological theories were, in their minds, describing the same thing from opposite ends of history. This is where the story moves from the merely disturbing into something that is genuinely difficult to categorize. Because what the Ahnenerbe was doing in Iran, in Tibet, in the other locations their expeditions reached, was not simply archaeology or even pseudoscience. It was a form of ritual, an attempt to make contact with an ancient power that they believed had shaped human civilization and could, if properly understood and invoked, be used to shape it again. They were not just looking for artifacts. They were looking for a key, and certain documents that have emerged from declassified SS archives in the decades since World War II suggest that at least some of the Ahnenerbe researchers believed they had found significant pieces of what they were looking for in the ancient Zoroastrian texts held in Iran, texts that were not publicly available, texts that were held by the Athravan, the fire-keeping priestly families, and that had never been translated into any European language. How those researchers gained access to those texts, and what exactly they found in them, is a question that the historical record answers only partially. What we know is that after certain German researchers returned from Iran in the mid-1930s, the Ahnenerbe's focus on ancient Iranian cosmology intensified significantly. And what we know is that those same researchers went to considerable lengths to ensure that their specific findings from Iran were kept separate from the general Ahnenerbe archive, classified at a level that even other SS officers could not access. Those particular files have never been fully recovered. Whether they were destroyed in the final days of the war, hidden by surviving SS officers, or are sitting in an archive somewhere, waiting for the right researcher to find them, nobody knows. But the question of what German researchers found in the ancient fire temples of Iran in the 1930s is one that serious historians have been quietly circling for decades. Because whatever it was important enough to hide, and important enough, perhaps, that the people who hid it were afraid of what would happen if the wrong people found it first. Stop right there, because I need you to understand something before we go any further. Everything we have covered so far, Reza Shah, the telegram, the Nazi expeditions, the Ahnenerbe, the missing files, all of that is just the surface. That is the part of this story that exists in history books and declassified archives and academic papers that most people never read. What comes next is different. What comes next goes deeper than politics, deeper than ideology, deeper than anything that happened in the 20th century or the 19th century, or even the ancient empires we have been exploring tonight. Because buried underneath all of it, underneath the name change and the Nazi obsession and the fire-keeping priesthoods, there is something older, something that was already ancient when Cyrus the Great was building his empire, something that Zoroaster encoded into his most sacred writings in the form of a prophecy that describes, with unsettling precision, a sequence of events that would signal the beginning of the end of one age of human civilization and the start of another. And when you hear what that prophecy actually says, and when you compare it to the events of the last 90 years, you are going to want to sit down, because the sequence has already started. Let us talk about the most mysterious prophet in human history. Not the most famous, not the most widely worshipped, but almost certainly the most mysterious. His name was Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, in the older form, and if you have heard that name at all in a modern context, it is probably because of Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher who borrowed it for his most famous work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, published in 1883. Nietzsche chose that name deliberately. He believed that Zoroaster, more than any other figure in human history, had most profoundly shaped the moral framework of Western civilization. And that, therefore, Zoroaster was the right person to announce that that framework needed to be completely dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. That is how significant this figure was, even to a 19th century German philosopher with no particular religious commitments. But the real Zoroaster, the historical figure, the prophet, the man who stood in some ancient landscape and looked up at the sky and came back with a vision of reality that changed the world, is someone we know almost nothing about with certainty. And the first thing we know nothing about with certainty is when he lived. This is not a minor academic dispute. The disagreement about Zoroaster's date spans approximately 5,000 years of human history, which is one of the most extraordinary chronological uncertainties attached to any major religious figure anywhere in the world. The majority of Western scholars, working from linguistic analysis of the oldest Zoroastrian texts, place Zoroaster somewhere between 1500 and 1000 BC. That would make him roughly contemporary with the later period of Egyptian New Kingdom pharaohs. A very ancient figure, certainly, but within the general range of what we think of as recorded history. But the traditional Zoroastrian chronology says something dramatically different. According to the most ancient Persian historical traditions, Zoroaster lived 6,000 years before the sack of Troy. The sack of Troy, in the most commonly accepted scholarly dating, occurred somewhere around 1200 BC, which means the traditional Persian dating places Zoroaster at approximately 6200 BC. 6200 BC. That is not ancient history. That is prehistory. That is before the first cities of Mesopotamia, before the earliest Egyptian hieroglyphs, before Stonehenge, before almost everything that we conventionally think of as the beginning of human civilization. If that traditional dating is even approximately correct, Zoroaster was not a figure from the ancient world as we understand it. He was a figure from a world we have almost entirely lost, and the texts he left behind, or that were composed in the tradition he founded, reflect something of that dizzying depth. The oldest portions of the Avesta, called the Gathas, are written in a form of Old Avestan so archaic that even scholars who have spent their entire careers studying it describe the experience of reading it as looking through extremely thick and distorted glass. The grammar is unusual. The vocabulary contains words that appear nowhere else in the known linguistic record. The imagery is dense and strange and seems to operate on multiple levels simultaneously, literal and metaphorical and cosmological all at once, in a way that makes it genuinely difficult to know, at any given moment, whether you are reading geography or theology or something that is trying to be both at the same time. And running through all of it through the Gathas, through the later Avestan texts, through the entire Zoroastrian theological tradition, is a specific vision of time and history that is unlike anything else in the ancient world. Zoroastrianism divides all of cosmic history into 4 great ages, each lasting 3,000 years. In the first age, Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity, the Lord of wisdom and light, creates a perfect world of pure spiritual reality. In the second age, Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, the force of darkness and deception, breaks into that perfect world and corrupts it. The third age is the long struggle between these two forces, played out through human history, through the choices of every individual soul that has ever lived. And the fourth age, the age we are currently in, according to Zoroastrian reckoning, is the final period, the endgame, the age that culminates in an event called Frashokereti. Frashokereti is one of the most extraordinary concepts in the entire history of religious thought. It means, in its most direct translation, making wonderful, or making excellent. It is the Zoroastrian vision of the end of history, not as destruction, not as apocalypse in the sense of catastrophic annihilation, but as a final renovation of reality, a restoration of the world to its original perfect state, the healing of all wounds, the resurrection of all the dead, the final and permanent defeat of darkness and deception, and the establishment of an eternal age of truth and light. Every soul that has ever lived will be restored. Every wrong that has ever been done will be made right. The material world itself will be transformed, purified by a great river of molten metal through which all beings will pass, experiencing it as warm milk if they are aligned with truth, and as burning agony if they are not. And at the end of that purification, there will be no more death, no more suffering, no more separation from the divine. This is not an obscure footnote in Zoroastrian theology. This is its central promise, the thing the entire system is oriented toward. The reason, in the Zoroastrian worldview, that human life and human choice matter at all, because every individual act of truth-telling, every individual act of justice, every individual choice to align with light, rather than darkness, accelerates the arrival of Frashokereti. Now, here is where this connects to the name change of 1935 in a way that is genuinely difficult to dismiss. Within certain streams of Zoroastrian esoteric tradition, traditions that were maintained by the Athravan priesthood, the firekeepers, the inner circle of those who preserved the most ancient and least publicly accessible layers of the teaching, there existed a specific set of prophecies about the signs that would precede Frashokereti. These prophecies were not part of the standard Avestan canon. They existed in supplementary texts, some of which were never written down at all, but were transmitted orally from priest to priest across generations. Some of them existed in written form, in texts held by specific priestly families, texts that were not shared outside those families, and that were not available to outside researchers, including, as we noted in the previous section, the German Ahnenerbe researchers, who were trying very hard to access them. Among these prophetic traditions, there was a specific cluster of signs associated with the restoration of the ancient name. The tradition held that one of the indicators of the approaching final age, one of the signals that Frashokereti was drawing near, would be the moment when the land of Iran was once again called by its true and ancient name in the languages of all the nations of the world, not just known by that name internally, not just used within the religious community, but acknowledged by the entire world, officially, formally, in the diplomatic and political language of the age. Think about what happened in 1935. For the first time in over 2,000 years, every government on Earth was formally requested, and in most cases complied with that request, to refer to this land by its ancient name, Iran, in official documents, in diplomatic correspondence, on maps, in legal treaties. The entire world, in the space of a single year. Whether Reza Shah was aware of this prophetic tradition, whether it was part of what motivated the name change, whether Teymourtash, who came from a family with deep roots in the Iranian religious tradition, had specifically designed the diplomatic initiative with this prophecy in mind. These are questions we cannot answer with certainty from the historical record that is publicly available. But what we can say is that within the Zoroastrian esoteric community, the name change of 1935 was not received as a political event. It was received as a prophetic fulfillment. Elderly Athravan priests, according to accounts that have been documented by scholars of Iranian religious history, wept when they heard the news. Not from nationalism, not from pride in a modern state's assertion of cultural identity, but from what they described as recognition, as the confirmation of something they had been waiting and watching for across generations. And here is the detail that makes this even harder to set aside. The Zoroastrian prophetic tradition did not describe the restoration of the name as the end of the process. It described it as the beginning. The restoration of the name was a signal, a starting gun, the first in a sequence of events that would unfold over the following decades, events that the tradition described in terms that are, when you read them with knowledge of 20th century Iranian history, genuinely unsettling in their accuracy. The tradition spoke of a great upheaval of the religious order, coming from within the land itself, that would follow the restoration of the name within a generation. It spoke of a period of intense conflict between the forces of the ancient and the modern. It spoke of the land being cut off from the outside world, surrounded, isolated, in conflict with the great powers of the age. Now consider what actually happened in Iran in the decades following 1935. The overthrow of Reza Shah himself in 1941 by British and Soviet forces. The nationalist movement of Mohammad Mossadegh in the early 1950s, followed by the CIA-backed coup that removed him. The revolution of 1979, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, that dismantled the entire Pahlavi dynasty and transformed Iran into an Islamic republic. The hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq war, the decades of sanctions and isolation that followed. A generation after the name change, Iran did experience a complete upheaval of its religious and political order. It was cut off from the Western world in ways that would have been almost inconceivable in 1935. It became one of the most isolated and contested nations on earth. I am not telling you that an ancient Zoroastrian prophecy predicted the Iranian Revolution. I am telling you that the people who had been preserving that prophetic tradition for 3,000 years believed that it did. And I am telling you that the German researchers who were desperately trying to access those esoteric Athravan texts in the 1930s, the ones whose specific findings were classified at the highest levels of the SS and have never been fully recovered, exactly this tradition, not for academic reasons, but because they believed, in the framework of their own dark ideology, that understanding what was coming next in Iran was strategically essential. That whatever was encoded in those firekeeper traditions about the sequence of events following the restoration of the ancient name, whatever the Athravan priesthood had been quietly watching for across 2,000 years of foreign conquest and cultural suppression, was information worth hiding from the world, worth killing for, perhaps, and worth dying to protect. The fire has been burning for 1,500 years without going out. Somebody has been tending it all this time. The question is, what they have been waiting for. There is a fire burning in the city of Yazd, in central Iran, that has not gone out in over 1,500 years. Let that land for a moment. 1,500 years, continuously burning, through the Arab conquest of Iran in the 7th century AD, through the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, through the rise and fall of the Safavid dynasty, the Qajar dynasty, the Pahlavi dynasty, through revolution and war, and sanctions, and every other upheaval that has torn through this region across a millennium and a half of turbulent history. The flame in the Atash Behram temple in Yazd, the highest grade of sacred fire in the Zoroastrian tradition, has been burning without interruption since approximately 470 AD, and the men and women whose families have been tending that fire across all those centuries are still there, still performing the same rituals, still maintaining the same protocols that were established before the Islamic conquest changed the face of this land forever. They are called the Athravan, the firekeepers, and they are one of the most extraordinary communities of living tradition on the face of the earth. To understand who they are, and why they matter to this story, you need to understand something about the nature of sacred fire in Zoroastrian theology that goes considerably deeper than the image of a flame burning on an altar. In Zoroastrian cosmology, fire is not a symbol of the divine. Fire is a direct physical manifestation of Ahura Mazda's presence in the material world. It is the visible form of Asha, the principle of truth, righteousness, and cosmic order that stands as the opposite of everything dark and deceptive in the universe. When you tend a sacred fire correctly, when you feed it with the right wood at the right times, when you maintain the ritual purity required to approach it, when you perform the prayers and ceremonies in the correct ancient language with the correct ancient intonations, you are not performing a symbolic act. You are, within this theological framework, literally sustaining the presence of divine truth in the physical world. Every time the fire is fed, it is an act of cosmic maintenance, a small but genuine contribution to the eventual victory of light over darkness, a single stitch in the immense tapestry of history that is slowly, across thousands of years, working its way toward Frasco Coretti. This is why the fire cannot go out, not ever. When the Arab armies swept across Iran in the 7th century and Islam became the dominant religion of the land, the Zoroastrian communities faced a choice that no community should ever have to face. They could convert, they could maintain their faith in secret, at enormous personal risk, or they could leave. A significant portion of the Iranian Zoroastrian community chose to leave. They made the journey across the Arabian Sea to the western coast of India, where they established a community that has survived and in many ways thrived for over 1,000 years. These are the Parsi people, and they are one of the most remarkable diaspora communities in human history. The word Parsi simply means Persian. It is the Indian pronunciation of the same root. The Parsi community in India, concentrated primarily in the Mumbai region, maintained the Zoroastrian faith, the ancient language traditions, the ritual practices, and the cultural memory of pre-Islamic Iran with a fidelity that is, when you study it closely, almost incomprehensible in its dedication. For over 1,000 years, while Iran itself was transformed by successive waves of Islamic culture and governance, a community in India was keeping the flame of ancient Iranian civilization alive, literally and figuratively. The Parsi community produced, among other things, some of the most successful industrialists and philanthropists in Indian history. The Tata family founders of one of the largest and most influential corporate empires in the world is Parsi. Freddie Mercury, one of the most iconic musicians of the 20th century, was Parsi. Zubin Mehta, the legendary orchestra conductor, is Parsi. But underneath the remarkable worldly success of the Parsi community, there has always been something else, a private, carefully maintained inner life, a set of traditions and texts and practices that are not shared with outsiders. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange. Because the Athravan, the priestly class within the Zoroastrian tradition, both in Iran and in the Parsi community in India, are not simply religious functionaries performing ancient ceremonies for a dwindling congregation. They are the custodians of a body of knowledge that has never been fully shared with the academic world. The publicly available Zoroastrian canon, the texts that scholars have translated and published and analyzed, represents, by the admission of the Athravan themselves, only a portion of the total body of written and oral tradition that exists within the community. How large a portion is impossible to say with precision, because the very existence of the non-public materials is something that the Athravan have historically been extremely reluctant to confirm in detail. What we know comes from fragments, from things that were mentioned in passing by scholars who gained partial access to priestly families over the centuries, from references in the publicly available texts to other texts that have never appeared in any published collection, from the occasional careful disclosure made by individual priests who felt, for whatever reason, that a particular piece of knowledge needed to be preserved in a form that would survive even if their family line did not. What those fragments suggest is this: the esoteric Athravan tradition contains detailed cosmological records that go significantly beyond anything in the published Avesta. Records that describe the physical and spiritual geography of Ariana Vaeja, the original homeland, in terms that are specific enough to suggest they were based on actual geographical knowledge rather than pure mythology. Records that describe the sequence of world ages, not just in broad theological terms, but in what appear to be specific historical predictions. records that contain what the tradition itself describes as the words of Zoroaster that were too dangerous to share with the uninitiated. Too dangerous. That phrase appears in multiple independent accounts from researchers who have had limited access to Athravan communities over the past 2 centuries. Not too sacred, not too complex. Which raises an obvious question. Dangerous to whom? And why? One answer that has been proposed by scholars working at the intersection of Iranian religious history and ancient cosmology is this. The Zoroastrian esoteric tradition may contain a detailed map of the process by which Frashokerati arrives. Not just the signs that precede it, not just the theological framework for understanding it, but an actual operational account of how the transformation of the world from its current corrupted state to its restored perfect state actually occurs. What happens, in what order, through what events, and what agents. If such a document existed, if there was a text that described, with the specificity that the known Zoroastrian prophetic tradition suggests was possible, the sequence of events that would transform the world, then the question of who should have access to that information becomes not academic, but urgently practical. A government that believed such a document was real would want it. An intelligence service that thought it contained accurate predictions of geopolitical upheaval would dedicate significant resources to obtaining it. A religious movement that believed it described the literal end of history would treat it as the most important document in existence. And an ancient priestly family that had been protecting it for 3,000 years would understand, with absolute clarity, why it could not be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. Now bring this back to the 1930s. Taimurtash, the man who designed the name change initiative and died mysteriously in Reza Shah's prison, came from a family with roots in the Mazandarani region of northern Iran. That region has historically been one of the areas with the most persistent and deeply rooted pre-Islamic religious traditions in the country. Scholars of Iranian religious history have documented the survival of Zoroastrian and Proto-Zoroastrian practices in the mountain communities of Mazandaran. Well into the modern period, practices that survived in forms so traditional that they preserved elements of ritual that had disappeared from the mainstream Zoroastrian tradition centuries earlier. Whether Taimurtash himself had direct connections to Athravan tradition is not something that can be established from the public record, but the circumstantial connections are substantial enough that serious researchers have raised the question. And then there is the matter of what happened after his death. In the months following Taimurtash's arrest in 1932, several members of his personal household staff disappeared. Not dramatically, not in ways that generated official investigations or newspaper coverage. They simply ceased to appear in the records. No emigration documents, no death certificates, no paper trail of any kind. Among them, according to one account preserved in a private Iranian family archive and referenced by an Iranian historian writing in the 1980s, was a man described only as the keeper of the minister's library. A man whose specific responsibility, according to this account, was the maintenance of a collection of manuscripts that Taimurtash had spent years quietly assembling from Zoroastrian communities across Iran and from the Parsi diaspora in India. What happened to those manuscripts, whether they were seized by Reza Shah's government, whether they were hidden by the library keeper before he disappeared, whether they found their way to Berlin through the network of German-Iranian cultural exchange that was operating at full intensity during that same period, is not known. What is known is that within 2 years of Taimurtash's death and the disappearance of his household staff, the Ahnenerbe's focus on Iranian esoteric material intensified dramatically. New researchers were assigned specifically to the study of Zoroastrian cosmological texts, and a new classification level was created within the Ahnenerbe archive, a level above the standard SS security protocols specifically for materials related to what the internal documents called the Iranian fire tradition. The fire in Yazd is still burning. The Athravan are still there, still tending it, still maintaining rituals that have not changed in 1500 years. And somewhere in an archive, in a family collection, in a vault whose location is known only to a small number of people who have sworn oaths that make ordinary secular promises look trivial, by comparison, the texts that Taimurtash was assembling may still exist. The question is not whether those texts contain something significant. The question is whether the world is ready for what they say. The firekeepers have apparently decided, for 3,000 years running that it is not. All right, I have to stop here for just a second, because if you have made it this far into this video, you are not a casual viewer. You are someone who genuinely wants to understand how the world actually works underneath the surface of what we are told. And that means something to me. So here is my question for you, and I want you to actually answer this one in the comments. Do you think the name change of 1935 was a political move, a calculated act of nationalism and diplomacy by a modernizing Shah trying to reshape his country's image on the world stage? Or do you think it was something older and stranger than that, the deliberate fulfillment of an ancient prophecy, engineered by people who understood exactly what they were invoking, political strategy, or ancient ritual? Drop your answer below, because I genuinely cannot wait to read what this particular audience thinks about that question. Now, we are not done yet. Here is something that should not be possible. A country officially changes its name. It sends formal diplomatic notifications to every government on Earth. It updates its own legal documents, its passports, its currency, its official correspondence. The international community acknowledges the change. The United Nations uses the new name. Every atlas published after 1935 reflects the new name, and yet 90 years later the old name refuses to die. You still say Persian rug, not Iranian rug. You still say Persian cat. You still say Persian Gulf. Millions of people, in dozens of languages, every single day, reach for a name that was officially retired nearly a century ago and use it without thinking twice. Why? That question sounds simple, but the answer reaches into some of the deepest and most fascinating territory in the study of how human beings store and transmit knowledge across generations. And it tells us something essential about the relationship between names, power, and the architecture of collective memory that no history book I have ever encountered has fully reckoned with. Let us start with the most obvious layer. Persia was not just a name. By the time Reza Shah tried to retire it in 1935, it had been embedded in the English language and in French and German and Italian and virtually every other major European tongue for over 2,000 years. It had generated an enormous ecosystem of derivative words, compound phrases, cultural references, and associated meanings that existed independently of whatever any particular government in Tehran decided to call itself. Persian literature, Persian mathematics, Persian astronomy, Persian miniature painting, Persian carpet weaving traditions that had been exported across the world and classified in the taxonomies of European collectors and dealers under that name for centuries. These were not just labels. They were entire fields of human knowledge organized around a specific linguistic anchor. When you change the anchor, you do not automatically reorganize all the knowledge attached to it. The knowledge stays where it is, and the old name stays with it. This is what linguists call lexical persistence. The tendency of words that are deeply embedded in a language's semantic network, words with many connections to many other words and concepts, to resist replacement even when there are strong social or political pressures, pushing for that replacement. The more connections a word has, the harder it is to dislodge. And Persia, by 1935, had approximately 2,000 years worth of connections. But lexical persistence is only part of the story, because the survival of the word Persia in Western languages is not just a linguistic phenomenon, it is a psychological one. And understanding the psychology of it reveals something genuinely important about how collective memory works and how it can be used as a form of resistance. Think about what Persia meant to the Western imagination at the moment. Reza Shah tried to retire it. It meant antiquity. It meant the exotic and the magnificent and the slightly dangerous romance of the ancient East. It meant the poetry of Hafez and Rumi poems that had been circulating in European translation since the 18th century and had influenced everyone from Goethe to Emerson to the Romantic poets. It meant the architectural wonder of Persepolis, which European travellers had been visiting and writing about with breathless admiration since the 17th century. Persia, in the Western collective imagination, was not a political entity. It was a myth, a living myth, ancient and golden and impossibly rich in meaning. Iran, by contrast, was a new word to Western ears. A word with no accumulated resonance, no emotional weight, no network of associations built up over centuries of cultural exchange. Replacing Persia with Iran, from the perspective of the Western imagination, was not like renaming a country. It was like being told that the word for gold was being changed to a word you had never heard before. The gold was still there. The value was still there. But the word felt wrong, unfamiliar, like something important had been lost in translation. And this is where it gets politically significant, because the survival of the word Persia in Western usage was not always innocent or neutral. In certain contexts, it became a form of implicit resistance to Iranian political authority, a way of signaling, without saying it directly, that the Western world reserved the right to name things as it chose regardless of what the people those things referred to actually wanted to be called. This dynamic became explosively apparent in the dispute over the Persian Gulf. The body of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula has been called the Persian Gulf in Western geographical tradition since at least the 16th century. Ancient Greek and Roman sources refer to it consistently. Every major European atlas for 5 centuries has used some version of that name. The Persian Gulf is, from a historical standpoint, one of the most consistently and unambiguously named geographical features on Earth. But in the 1960s and 70s, as Arab nationalism grew in political power across the Middle East, several Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf monarchies, began pushing for the adoption of the name Arabian Gulf instead. The argument was essentially political. The Arab states of the region outnumbered Iran. Their populations lived along most of the coastline. The name Persian Gulf, they argued, was a relic of Iranian imperial dominance that did not reflect the modern demographic reality of the region. Iran's response to this campaign was, to put it mildly, intense. The Iranian government at various times threatened to cut diplomatic ties with countries that used the alternative name. Iranian airlines refused to fly to countries whose official maps used Arabian Gulf. When Google Maps briefly displayed Arabian Gulf as an alternative name for the body of water in some regional versions of their application, the Iranian government's response was swift enough and fierce enough that it made international headlines. This was not a proportionate response to a cartographic footnote. This was a government acting as if its fundamental identity was under attack, because in a very real sense, it was. Remember what we established earlier in this story. The name Iran carries with it the full weight of the ancient Aryan identity, the first land, the original homeland, the axis of human civilization as described in the most ancient surviving religious texts on earth. For the Iranian government, and for a significant portion of the Iranian population, the Persian Gulf is not simply a convenient geographical label. It is a piece of evidence, a marker on the historical record that confirms Iran's primordial presence in this region. To replace Persian Gulf with Arabian Gulf is not, from this perspective, a minor renaming. To perform on a geographical feature, the same kind of identity theft that outsiders performed on the civilization itself when they called it Persia instead of Iran. The deep irony here is extraordinary. Iran spent the 1930s insisting the world stop using the word Persian and start using the word Iran. And Iran has spent the decades since then insisting the world continue using the word Persian in Persian Gulf and refuse to switch to Arabian. The same country. 2 completely opposite positions about the same root word in different contexts for different political purposes. And both positions make perfect sense once you understand what is actually at stake. Persian is acceptable when it is attached to a geographical feature that establishes Iranian primacy in the region. Persian is unacceptable when it is attached to a civilization in a way that allows outsiders to define and contain what that civilization is and was. The distinction is not about the word itself. It is about who controls the meaning of the word. That is the real lesson buried in 90 years of linguistic persistence and political dispute over what to call this land and its surrounding waters. Names are not labels. They are not neutral descriptors attached to things for convenience. Names are claims. Every name is an assertion of the right to define reality, and the struggle over what to call a country, a body of water, a people, a civilization that struggle is never really about linguistics. It is always about power, about who gets to write the story, about whose version of the past becomes the foundation on which the future is built. Persia survives in the Western imagination because the Western imagination built something on top of it. A whole architecture of meaning and association and cultural reference that it is not willing to abandon simply because a government in Tehran issued a diplomatic decree, and Iran insists on Iran because the people of that land understand, with a clarity born from 3,000 years of having their identity defined by outsiders, that the name you answer to is the name you become. Both sides of that tension are telling the truth, and neither side is willing to surrender. In the months following the 1935 decree, something quietly extraordinary began happening in libraries, archives, and government offices across the Western world. Maps were being changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, not in ways that generated public debate or newspaper coverage, or any kind of formal acknowledgement that something significant was being erased. Just quietly, systematically, institution by institution, shelf by shelf, the word Persia was being replaced with the word Iran on every official cartographic document that governments and universities and publishing houses were willing to update. And the old maps, the ones that could not be updated because they were historical artifacts, printed on paper that was already decades or centuries old, those were being reclassified, recategorized, filed under new organizational systems that made them harder to find, harder to access, harder to connect to the current political and geographical reality of the region. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented archival history. When scholars began systematically studying the treatment of pre-1935 maps in major Western archives during the latter half of the 20th century, what they found was a pattern of handling that was, at minimum, deeply inconsistent, and, at maximum, evidence of deliberate institutional pressure to reorganize historical cartographic memory around the new political reality. In certain British library collections, maps, labelled Persia, that predated the name change, were recatalogued in ways that placed them in historical rather than geographical organizational systems, meaning that a researcher looking for maps of the region would not automatically encounter them unless they already knew to look in the historical section rather than the geographical one. The practical effect of this recategorization was to make the historical record of Persian identity less immediately accessible to casual researchers. In several major American university libraries, similar patterns emerged. Maps and atlases containing the word Persia were flagged for updated labeling. In some cases, adhesive labels were physically applied to the spines of bound atlases, covering the word Persia with the word Iran. Those labels are still visible today in certain collections, a strange physical palimpsest, the new name lying on top of the old one, like a thin skin stretched over something it cannot quite cover. These institutional responses were not centrally coordinated in any way that historians have been able to document. They appear to have been independent decisions made by individual institutions, responding to the same general political pressure, the pressure of wanting to maintain correct diplomatic relations with a government that had made extremely clear it cared intensely about how its name was represented in foreign institutions, but the cumulative effect was real. For a researcher beginning their study of this region in, say, 1955, the archival landscape they encountered had already been substantially reorganized around the 1935 name change. The visual and documentary evidence of the pre-Iran period, the period when the entire Western world understood this civilization under the name Persia, was still there, technically, but it was organized in ways that made it feel historical, remote, separated from the present by an archival barrier that was not physically impenetrable but was psychologically significant. Memory, as any cognitive scientist will tell you, is not simply about whether information exists. It is about how easily that information can be retrieved. Bury something deep enough in an archive, reclassify it subtly enough, and you do not need to destroy it to effectively remove it from the living record of human knowledge. Now, let us talk about something older and considerably more mysterious. The Tabula Peutingeriana. For those of you who are encountering that name for the first time, the Tabula Peutingeriana is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of cartography. It is a medieval copy, made sometime around the 12th or 13th century AD, of a Roman road map that originally dated from around the 4th century AD, and which itself was based on even older Roman geographical surveys reaching back to the 1st century BC. The map is extraordinary in its physical form. It is not a sheet of paper. it is a scroll, a very long, very narrow scroll, approximately 22 feet long and just over 1 foot wide, that depicts the entire known world of the Roman Empire in a highly stylized, deliberately distorted form that prioritizes the practical information a Roman traveler would need over geographical accuracy as we understand it today. It shows roads, it shows distances, it shows cities and rivers and mountain ranges and coastal features, and it covers an enormous geographical range, from Britain in the west to India and Sri Lanka in the east, including the territories that correspond to modern Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. The sections of the tabula that cover the Iranian plateau are among the most densely annotated portions of the entire map. The region is labelled, in the medieval copy, with a form of the name that corresponds to the Latin Persia. Road distances are marked. Regional subdivisions are indicated with a level of detail that suggests the original Roman source material for this section was exceptionally good. But here is the detail that researchers working on ancient cartography have found increasingly difficult to explain. In certain sections of the tabula's Iranian coverage, there are place names and geographical features that do not correspond to any known Roman source, names that appear in no other Roman geographical text, names that use linguistic forms that are not Latin, not Greek, and not the Aramaic that served as the administrative language of the Parthian and Sasanian empires that Rome was dealing with during the period covered by the map. Some of those names use linguistic forms that are considerably older, forms that connect, in ways that philologists have described as linguistically verifiable, but historically inexplicable, to the oldest layers of the Avestan language tradition, which raises a question that nobody in mainstream cartographic history has been willing to engage with directly. Where did the original Roman cartographers get those names? The standard explanation is that Roman geographical knowledge of the Iranian interior was assembled through a combination of merchant reports, diplomatic contacts, and the accounts of soldiers and travelers who had moved through the region. This is certainly true for the broad outlines of the map, but it does not adequately explain the presence of archaic Avestan linguistic forms in a document whose other Iranian content is clearly based on contemporaneous Roman-era sources. One possibility, a possibility that has been raised in academic contexts careful enough to frame it as a hypothesis rather than a claim, is that the Roman cartographers who assembled the original survey had access to Iranian geographical sources that predated the Achaemenid Empire, sources that preserved geographical knowledge from the period when the Avestan texts themselves were being composed, sources that would have been held and potentially shared with outside researchers in limited ways by exactly the kind of priestly custodial community we have been discussing throughout this story. The Athravan, in other words, may have been sharing selected geographical knowledge with Roman researchers, while simultaneously withholding the cosmological and prophetic context that would have made that knowledge fully meaningful, giving the map without giving the legend. And then there is the question of what has happened to that cartographic knowledge in the period since 1935. Because here is the thing about changing a name on a map. You do not just change what the map says, you change what the map means. You change the story that the map tells about the relationship between the land and the people who have inhabited it across time. Every map that now shows Iran where Persia used to be is not simply an updated geographical document. It is a reframing of historical narrative. It is an implicit argument about continuity and identity, about which thread of history connects the ancient civilization to the modern state. And that argument has consequences, because if the land is Iran, if it has always been Iran, in its deepest and most ancient identity, then the story of that land is not the story of a great empire that rose and fell and was conquered and renamed. It is the story of a continuous civilization that was temporarily obscured by outside naming conventions and has now reasserted its true identity. That is a very different story, with very different implications for how the region's history is taught, how its political claims are evaluated, and how its future is imagined. Whoever controls the name controls the narrative, and whoever controls the narrative controls the map. Not just the physical map, the map in the collective human mind, the invisible geography of meaning and memory and identity that shapes how billions of people understand where they are, where they came from, and where they are going. That map is still being contested, and the most important battles are being fought not with armies or sanctions or diplomatic cables, but with words, with the quiet, persistent, enormously consequential question of what we call this ancient land and what that name commits us to believing about the world. We have covered a lot of ground: Nazi expeditions, ancient prophecies, firekeepers guarding texts that have never been translated, maps with names that should not exist, a minister who knew too much and ended up dead before the plan he designed was ever carried out. Every single thread we have pulled has led somewhere darker and stranger than where we started. But here is what I've not told you yet. There is a discovery. A physical, archaeological, scientifically documented discovery made not in the 1930s, not by Nazi researchers with an ideological agenda, but in the early 2000s by a team of Iranian archaeologists working with ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging technology that did not exist a generation ago. What they found, buried under the desert of southeastern Iran, rewrites the timeline of human civilization, not adjusts it, not complicates it, rewrites it. And the most prominent archaeologist on that team, the man who spent years trying to get the international academic community to take this discovery seriously, died under circumstances that his own colleagues have described in print as deeply suspicious. The discovery is real. The evidence is documented. The academic community's response to it has been, to put it very gently, extraordinary in its silence. What they found changes everything. In the spring of 2001, a farmer in the Halil River Valley, in the Jiroft region of southeastern Iran, made a discovery that should have changed everything we think we know about the origins of human civilization. He was not looking for anything. He was simply walking through land that had been partially exposed by flooding, the kind of flooding that occasionally strips away the top layer of desert soil and reveals what has been sitting underneath for thousands of years. What he found were artifacts. Extraordinary artifacts. Objects carved from chlorite stone with a level of artistic sophistication and technical precision that was immediately recognizable as the product of a highly advanced culture. Goblets and boxes and cylinder seals decorated with mythological scenes, winged eagles, serpents, human figures in ritual postures, rendered with a delicacy and confidence that spoke of a artistic tradition that had been developing and refining itself for a very long time. Word spread quickly through the local community. And then, as it always does in these situations, the looting began. Before Iranian authorities could secure the site, an estimated number of artifacts running into the tens of thousands had been removed from the ground and sold into the international antiquities market. Objects from Jiroft began appearing in auction houses in London and New York and Geneva. Dealers who handled them noted, with professional interest, that the style was unfamiliar. It did not match the known artistic vocabulary of Sumer or Babylon or Egypt or any of the other ancient civilizations whose artifacts regularly passed through the international market. It was something else. Something that did not fit neatly into the existing map of ancient world history. When Iranian archaeologist Youssef Majidzadeh arrived at the site in 2002 and began conducting systematic excavations, what he found exceeded even the extraordinary promise of those initial looted artifacts. Jiroft was not a single site. It was a civilization, spread across an area of the Halil River Valley that covered hundreds of square kilometers. There were the remains of a fully developed urban culture with monumental architecture, sophisticated water management systems, standardized weights and measures suggesting organized trade, and a writing system that predated the currently accepted timeline of writing in the region and that has not yet been fully deciphered. Majidzadeh spent years studying the stratigraphy, the layered geological record that allows archaeologists to date different levels of occupation at a site by their depth and their relationship to surrounding geological features. And what the stratigraphy told him was deeply uncomfortable for the established consensus in ancient history. The oldest layers of occupation at Jiroft dated to approximately 5000 BC, or possibly earlier. 5000 BC. That is roughly contemporaneous with the very earliest stages of Sumerian civilization in Mesopotamia. But here is what made Majidzadeh's findings genuinely explosive. The Jiroft civilization, at its earliest layers, showed no signs of being in an early developmental stage. It showed no signs of the gradual, halting experimentation that characterizes the beginning of a new cultural tradition. It appeared, from the archaeological record, to have arrived already formed, already sophisticated, already in possession of the architectural knowledge, the artistic vocabulary, and the organizational complexity that other ancient civilizations took centuries to develop, which raises a question that Majid-Zadeh raised publicly, in academic publications and international conferences, in terms that were careful and scholarly, but whose implications were unmistakable. What if Jiroft was not one of the early civilizations of the ancient world? What if it was the source? What if the artistic motifs, the architectural techniques, the administrative systems, and possibly even the writing that appear in Sumer and in early Indus Valley sites and in Proto-Elamite culture, what if all of those did not develop independently or influence each other laterally? What if they all flowed from a single upstream source, a civilization in the Iranian plateau that was already old when the first Sumerian cities were being built, a civilization that had been developing in the Halil River Valley for centuries or millennia before the historical record as we currently understand it begins? Majid-Zadeh pointed to specific pieces of evidence that supported this hypothesis. The chlorite vessels found at Jiroft, the carved stone objects that first attracted attention, contain decorative programs that show up in simplified or derivative forms at sites across an enormous geographical range. Similar motifs appear at early Sumerian sites in modern Iraq, at Bronze Age sites in the Indus Valley in modern Pakistan, at sites in Bactria in modern Afghanistan, and at early Bronze Age sites in the Arabian Peninsula. The geographical spread of these motifs traces a pattern that, when mapped, radiates outward from the Jiroft region like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. In the established academic framework, this kind of widespread cultural motif distribution is typically explained as evidence of trade networks, merchants carrying objects and ideas from one region to another, with styles spreading laterally through contact. This explanation is reasonable and has substantial support in the archaeological record for many ancient cultural phenomena, but there is a problem with applying it straightforwardly to the Jiroft motifs. The problem is directionality. When you have a motif that appears in its most complex, most fully developed form at one location and in progressively simpler, more schematic forms, as you move away from that location in every direction, the standard archaeological interpretation is that the complex form is the source and the simpler forms are derivatives. The idea traveled outward from the center, simplifying and transforming as it moved. At Jiroft, the motifs appear in their most complex form. At every other site where they appear, they are simpler. Majid-Zadeh was not making a nationalist claim. He was not saying Iran is the greatest civilization in history because of ethnic or racial superiority. He was making a specific, evidence-based archaeological argument that the material record, interpreted according to standard archaeological methodology, points to the Halil River Valley as a center of cultural origination rather than cultural reception. The international academic response to this argument was, as I mentioned at the close of the previous section, extraordinary in its silence. Not hostile silence. Not the silence of active suppression. Something in some ways more unsettling than either of those things. The silence of institutional inertia, of a field that had organized itself around a particular understanding of where civilization began in Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent, in the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, and that found it genuinely difficult to process evidence that suggested the map needed to be redrawn. Major Western archaeological journals published some of Majid-Zadeh's findings, but the synthesis, the overarching argument about Jiroft as a potential origin point for multiple ancient civilizations, simultaneously received far less engagement than the individual site reports. The implications were acknowledged in footnotes and qualified in careful academic language, but they were not taken up and examined with the same energy that a comparably significant discovery in a more conventionally prestigious archaeological region would have generated. There are legitimate academic reasons for caution. The looting of the site in its early stages compromised the integrity of the stratigraphic record in ways that make certain dating claims difficult to verify independently. The undeciphered writing system at Jiroft cannot yet be read, which means the civilization cannot speak for itself in the way that Sumerian and Egyptian civilizations can. And extraordinary claims, as the scientific community correctly insists, require extraordinary evidence. But there is also a less flattering explanation for the muted response. Jiroft does not fit It does not fit the narrative of ancient history that has been built up over 2 centuries of Western-dominated archaeology. It does not fit the organizational frameworks of university departments and museum collections and academic publishing hierarchies that have been structured around a particular understanding of where civilization began and how it spread. Fitting Jiroft into the story properly would require not just adding a new chapter. It would require going back and rewriting several chapters that have already been published, taught, and institutionalized. And institutions, as any historian will tell you, do not rewrite their own foundational narratives without a fight. Now, connect this to everything we have discussed tonight. The name Iran means the land of the Arya. The land, as the Zoroastrian tradition describes it, that was created first. The original homeland, the axis of human civilization as described in the oldest surviving religious texts on Earth. For 3,000 years, that claim was theological, mythological, the kind of assertion that archaeologists and historians could classify as ancient religious belief and set politely aside while building their own evidence-based account of how civilization actually developed. Jiroft makes it archaeological, not proven, not beyond reasonable scholarly debate, but archaeological, physical, documentable, in the stratigraphic record of an actual site that can be visited, measured, dated, and analyzed. The ancient Zoroastrian texts said this land was the first land. The ground under the Iranian desert is beginning to suggest they may not have been entirely wrong. And Yusef Majidzadeh, the man who spent years trying to make the world pay attention to what was buried in the Halil River Valley, died in 2021. His colleagues have noted, in the careful language that academics use when they want to say something serious without committing to a direct accusation, that the international recognition his work deserved was never fully forthcoming during his lifetime, that the obstacles he encountered in getting his synthesis taken seriously went beyond the normal friction of academic debate. Whether those obstacles were the product of institutional conservatism, geopolitical discomfort with the implications of his findings, or something more deliberate, that is a question I cannot answer for you tonight. What I can tell you is this: the evidence is there, in the ground, in the published archaeological reports, in the motif distributions that radiate outward from the Halil River Valley across half the ancient world. The firekeepers have been saying for 3,000 years that this was the first land. The ground beneath the Iranian desert is starting to confirm it. And the world, for reasons that are worth examining very carefully, is still not entirely ready to listen. From a quiet telegram sent in 1935 to the buried ruins of a civilization that may predate everything we thought we knew about the origins of human history. From the courts of Cyrus the Great to the bunkers of the SS Ahnenerbe, from the sacred fire temples of Yazd to the desert valleys of Jiroft, from an ancient prophet whose dates span 5,000 years of scholarly disagreement to a modern archaeologist whose findings the academic world is still not fully prepared to absorb. And now we are here, at the question that all of those threads have been pulling us toward, not who changed the name, not when, or how, or even why in the narrow political sense, but what it means that names have this kind of power at all, what it means that a single word applied to a land, a people, a civilization, can carry inside it an entire cosmology, an entire claim about the structure of reality and the direction of history and the identity of the human race, and what it means that the struggle over that word is never, in any civilization, at any point in history, simply a struggle over linguistics. It is always a struggle over who gets to write the story of the world. Let us be precise about what that means. When outsiders named this civilization Persia, when Greek historians and Roman geographers and medieval European cartographers reached for that word and used it to label everything from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India, they were not simply identifying a geographical area for practical convenience. They were, whether they fully understood it or not, performing an act of definition, of containment, of interpretation. They were saying, this is what this thing is. This is how it fits into the story we are telling about the world. This is its role, its character, its place in the hierarchy of civilizations that our intellectual tradition has constructed. Persia, in the Western imagination, was always the magnificent other, the ancient and exotic empire that served as the backdrop against which Western civilization defined itself. The Greeks understood their own identity partly through their opposition to Persia, the free city-states against the despotic empire, democracy against monarchy, the West against the East. That opposition was not just political, it was philosophical. It was a story about what kind of civilization was possible and what kind was inevitable. And that story required Persia to be a certain thing, to play a certain role, to stay in its assigned position in the narrative. Iran refuses that role, not because of a diplomatic decree issued in 1935, but because what the name Iran actually asserts the claim it makes about this land's identity and its place in human history is fundamentally incompatible with the story that Western civilization has been telling about itself for 2,000 years. The Western narrative of civilization goes roughly like this. It begins in Mesopotamia and Egypt. It flowers in Greece. It is systematized by Rome. It is transmitted, transformed, and eventually fulfilled in the modern democratic and scientific traditions of Western Europe and North America. Everything else is peripheral. Everything else is context. Everything else is the background against which the main story unfolds. Iran, as a name, as an identity, as a claim, says something that directly challenges every assumption built into that narrative. It says, "We were here first." Not as a peripheral player in someone else's story, not as the exotic backdrop against which Western civilization found itself, but as the original. The land from which the concept of civilization itself organized urban life, codified law, monotheistic religion, the cosmic struggle between truth and deception that underlies the entire moral framework of the Western world, first emerged into human history. That is not a claim that fits comfortably into the existing narrative. And so the existing narrative has found various ways, across centuries, to manage the discomfort, sometimes through direct dismissal, sometimes through the kind of institutional inertia we saw in the response to Jiroft, sometimes through the subtler mechanism of continuing to use the old name Persia, which keeps this civilization in its assigned role as the ancient and magnificent other, rather than allowing it to occupy the position the name Iran actually claims. But here is what makes this larger than just a story about Iran, because Iran is not unique in this dynamic. It is simply one of the most dramatic and well-documented examples of something that has happened, is happening, and will continue to happen everywhere on Earth, where the names assigned by the powerful do not match the identity claimed by the people they are attached to. Think about Constantinople, one of the great cities of human civilization for over 1,000 years, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the center of Eastern Christianity, the meeting point of Europe and Asia. When the Ottoman Empire conquered it in 1453, it gradually became Istanbul. The Greek Orthodox Christian identity of the city was overlaid, generation by generation, with an Ottoman Muslim identity. The name change was not instantaneous. Constantinople persisted in Western usage for centuries after the conquest, for exactly the same reasons Persia persisted after 1935, because names that are deeply embedded in a civilization's sense of itself do not yield to political decree. Think about Ceylon, which became Sri Lanka in 1972, about Rhodesia, which became Zimbabwe in 1980, about the dozens of African nations that spent the post-independence decades systematically replacing the names that European colonizers had given to their cities, their rivers, their mountains, names that encoded a colonial understanding of the land and its people, with names drawn from indigenous languages and traditions. Every one of those name changes was a political act, but every one of them was also something deeper than politics. Every one of them was a civilization asserting the right to define itself, to choose the story it tells about its own identity, to refuse the role that outside naming had assigned to it, and claim something older, something more true, something that connects the living to their ancestors in ways that colonial or imperial naming deliberately severed. This is the real stakes of the Persia versus Iran question, not which name is more historically accurate, not which name is more convenient for Western mapmakers or more recognizable to Western audiences, but whether the people of a civilization have the right to name themselves, to reach back into their own deepest history and pull forward the identity they choose, to refuse the name given to them by their conquerors and their rivals and the outsiders who thought they understood this land better than the people who had been living on it for 10,000 years. The answer to that question seems obvious when you state it plainly. Of course they have that right, but the history of the last 90 years, the persistence of Persia in Western usage, the international dispute over the Persian Gulf, the muted academic response to Jiroft, the classified Arnanerbi files that have never been recovered, suggests that the obvious answer and the actual practice of the world are still very far apart. Names are the first battlefield. They are where the struggle over history begins quietly, almost invisibly, in the words we choose when we reach for the map and point to a place and say, "This is what this is." And as long as that struggle continues, the telegram sent from Tehran in 1935 has not finished delivering its message. It is still in transit, still working its way through the channels of human memory and collective identity, and the slow, grinding process by which civilizations reclaim what was taken from them. The name is Iran, and the story of what that name means is still being written. A single, quiet diplomatic message sent from Tehran to the embassies of the world in 1935. Just a decree that erased a name 2,000 years in the making and replaced it with something 3,000 years older. And what we found, when we followed that thread all the way down to where it leads, was not a simple story about nationalism or modernization or the political calculations of an ambitious Shah trying to reshape his country's image. We found Zoroaster. We found the Arnanerbe. We found firekeepers tending a flame that has not gone out in 1,500 years. We found a buried civilization in the Iranian desert that may be older than anything our history books are currently prepared to explain. We found classified SS files that have never been fully recovered. We found a minister who knew too much and died before the plan he designed was ever carried out. We found, underneath all of it, a truth that is larger and stranger and more consequential than any single name or any single decree. That the most important battles in human history are not fought with armies. They are fought with words, with names, with the quiet, persistent, enormously consequential act of deciding what to call the world and who gets to make that decision. Persia did not disappear in 1935. It went underground, into the Western imagination, into the Persian rugs and the Persian cats and the Persian Gulf and the poetry of Hafez and the architectural ghost of Persepolis standing in the desert with its broken columns pointing at the sky. And Iran did not begin in 1935. It was always there. In the ancient claim that this land was the first land, the original land, the land from which something essential about human civilization first entered the world. Both names are true, and the tension between them is a mirror held up to something fundamental about how we understand history, identity, and power. I am Mr. H. And this is the Mr. H Chronicles, the channel where the stories that get left out of the textbooks come to be told. If this story reached you the way I hoped it would, subscribe, hit the bell, and stay close. Next time, we are asking the question that haunted Alexander the Great, obsessed the SS, and that certain very old Zoroastrian texts may have already answered. Who was Cyrus the Great, really? The conqueror, the liberator, the man the Bible calls the anointed one of God, or something else entirely? I will see you there.